lots of people have landed on headlines and highlights of what we're being promised, thinking, oh, this is a flicker of a return. Does it sound like a reasonable way to go to you, Professor Ferguson?
Well, first of all, I'd say I don't think any final decisions have been made. But I'm encouraged that it's a cautious strategy and that all the government messaging is that they will take it one step at a time. I mean, the thing we don't want to repeat is what has happened on previous occasions, namely relaxing too fast. I mean, circumstances are different now. We have vaccination rolled out, but people just have to remember that whilst it's been a huge success, the vaccination programme, no vaccine is perfect and people have only had one dose yet. So we still need to be cautious.
Caution, definitely. And it's a balance, isn't it, of getting things going for those who need it to get going, but also keeping everyone safe. So do you have a figure in mind of what the R rate needs to be? Do you have a figure in mind of how the spread is going, that you must have something to judge against?
Yes, well, first of all, I've been very surprised and encouraged by how quickly case numbers have been coming down in recent weeks, particularly because of the new variant circulating in the country. Basically, cases are halving roughly every 2 weeks, a little bit slower than that. And so that means an R number of about 0.8. So we have a bit of leeway.
So
on top of that, we have that.
If that continues, is that enough? Just so that we can get a sense of where we need to be. You know, if it stays at 0.8, or if it looks like it continues down, how long does it have to stay at that level? You know, what's in your head?
So, first of all, we can't make accurate predictions, particularly in the case of the new variant. So what's going to happen, quite likely, as the Prime Minister's message is schools, maybe all schools, will reopen on 8th of March, we'll see. And then we need to take 2 or 3 weeks to see what impact that first change has on transmission, on the case numbers. And if we're still in a position where case numbers are falling, or at least flat, there may be then scope to go to the next stage. And so I think the government has been very clear on that they're intending to be cautious and follow the data, really, and what the data is telling them about how quickly we can relax.
Is that something you'd like to see, the returning of schools all at the same time, or would you prefer them to have the staggered return that we were led to believe would be the case?
All I would say is the modelling we and other groups and universities in the UK have been doing would suggest there probably is leeway to reopen all schools, but of course that poses slightly more of a risk than just, for instance, reopening primary schools. We know younger children are less risk and transmit less of this virus. So there's, as always, a balancing act here. You can be most risk averse and keep secondary schools shut, or you can, obviously kids need to be back in school, so you can take slightly more of a risk. My own overall judgment is we probably do have the headroom to reopen schools.
OK, that's a positive. Lots of our viewers getting in touch this morning, though, Professor Ferguson, saying caution, caution, caution. Let's not rush this. Let's not rush to get back and end up where we were and have been. Can you see, if the government manages this and gets the strategy right, can you see this being the last lockdown that we will all face?
I very much hope so, and that's, I think, why caution is needed. One of the other key things we don't yet know is quite how effective these vaccines are going to be. We have results from scientific studies, clinical trials, but the real world is a different thing. And so, again, as the government has said, we need to see how much protection vaccinated people have, how quickly death rates come down before we can be completely confident about going that next step and really reopening.
So for you, then, the decision is seeing, those case numbers staying low, understanding more about the vaccine. Is there also a concern about potential new variants? Could they come in and scupper things?
There's always a risk. So, there's 2 risks from new variants. One is importing them, and that's why the government's introduced these quarantine measures. The other is that, as we've seen with our current new variant, is it arising here. That's another reason to keep case numbers low. The risk then becomes lower of that. But our current virus, which is the dominant one in the country, only requires 1 or 2 more mutations to partially escape immunity. And that means immunity naturally gained or immunity gained by being vaccinated. And so it is imperative that we monitor the situation as closely as we can, and as has been happening in Bristol, clamp down, use mass testing if we see any signs of clusters of dangerous new variants.
Professor Scally, I mean,
hold on, Kate. So one last thing, if I may, to Professor Ferguson, because I know we may lose you shortly. We are set to have more rule changes, and we can see how complicated it has been for people to navigate those rules over the course of all these pandemics. You yourself, front line with this, advising the government on their strategy, fell foul of breaking some rules way back, of course. Do you have sympathy for some of the people that find themselves with COVID exhaustion, bending the rules, or those that are, without realising, breaking the rules as well and finding themselves on the wrong side of the law?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's been an incredibly difficult year for everybody. I think all I would say is, I mean, I think in the last stretch. It may be a few more months yet, but I would certainly urge the government that the simpler you can make the rules to follow, the better, and giving that hope to the population that there is a route out of here.
Professor Scally, you're looking at the same figures as Professor Ferguson. You're from Independence Age. Why do you feel that it isn't the right time to start opening up and we do need to wait longer?
Well, I do agree with Professor Ferguson. We need to look at the data, and the numbers of cases are coming down, and they're coming down at a good, steady rate. But they started coming down from a whopping peak. So there's a long way to go still. And we do need the cases down. And we need the cases down consistently if we're going to open up around the country. We can't repeat the mistakes that we made in the past by loosening restrictions in places where there still is a lot of circulating virus. So I think local data is really important as well. And I would prefer if there was a strategic plan for getting us out of the restrictions by driving down the virus, by making schools safe before they reopen them, by taking on extra space, by improving ventilation, by extending mask wearing in schools. All of these things will help. But I don't get the feeling that the government's interested in anything other than a simple, this is the date when we'll drop restrictions. And finally, one important thing, if we're going to get the numbers down, keep them down, could we please have a fine test, trace, isolate and support system? We don't test close contacts in this country. You only get, if you're a close contact, you're asked to self-isolate, but you don't get tested unless you get symptoms. And that's completely contrary to the European guidance, to the guidance from CDC in Atlanta. And you're only asked to isolate for 10 days these days instead of 14 days, which is the sort of recognised international norm. So we're not doing all of that stuff very well. And there's no reason why that shouldn't be improved before we start lifting restrictions.
Kate Nichols, you're the Chief Executive of UK Hospitality, one of the sectors that have been so savagely hit by these lockdowns. How sort of positive did you feel this morning waking up and looking at the newspapers? And what do you think you'd like to see from the government over the next few weeks in terms of trying to get the hospitality sector back on its feet?
Well, I think it's hard to remain positive when we've got such dire numbers coming out of the sector. Just 1 in 5 of our businesses have sufficient cash to be able to survive to March. And so for them, every week of closure that goes on is as a further erosion of their ability to continue to trade, their ability to remain viable, and crucially, their ability to keep employing their staff. So what we want to see from the government is a very clear phased exit strategy from the lockdown and then from the restrictions that the hospitality sector is facing. Because even if we open up under lockdown, we're opening up under very strict restrictions that meant we didn't break even last year when we were trading from July. So we can be confident that we can be safe when we reopen and when the time is right. We need to see not just that initial date, but the phasing out of those restrictions linked to the rollout of the vaccine.
Eat Out to Help Out was a scheme that did seem to work, didn't it, in terms of getting people out and using cafes and restaurants. However, it was then seen to be one of the things that led to higher infection rates. As soon as it was closed, infection rates in the areas dropped dramatically in those areas where they had been higher. So, do you have thoughts about what the government could do to safely boost it?
Well, I think, we can look confidently at what happened in July. We did reopen with the toughest COVID secure protocols for hospitality in the world, drawing on our international experience. We put in place mitigation factors that addressed all of those risks. And actually, during July and August, while we were trading through Eat Out to Help Out, you didn't see any significant uptick in infections as a result of that. So we do know that we opened safely. What we also know is that the government reopened and put in place support measures. So we had not just Eat Out to Help Out to drive demand and drive people back onto the high street, not just into hospitality, but more generally to go out. But we had a lower rate of VAT to support hospitality to create a consumer demand. And we also had 100% business rates holiday to take away those fixed costs. We need those schemes extending from the 31st of March. And if we are to stay closed or severely restricted for much longer, then we are going to need to have additional government support over and above that, flexible furlough and grants going on beyond the 31st of March so that our businesses can survive, because hospitality is the third largest employer in the country, over 4 million people in our outlets, but also in our supply chain, and very significant driver of high street investment. So it's important that the hospitality sector does get back open and gets firing on all cylinders as swiftly and as safely as we possibly can.
Let's talk to former Education Secretary Justine Greening now as well, because of course education is a hugely important part. Lots of our viewers are parents, Justine. They'll be watching this morning, looking at March the 8th as potentially the date that their kids can go back to school. The vast majority, as we've said, are all saying we urge caution with the government doing this. Do you adhere to what Professor Scally is suggesting, that actually trying to facilitate this in the way where classrooms are bigger, so there's more space between the students, is one of the things that you would like to see as well, to make that the transmission harder in the small classrooms? We see 30, 35 kids in some of our classrooms that are just too small.
Yes, potentially. I think we should look at whatever it takes to make sure we can get schools open. And there are a lot of parents who are really desperate to see schools open so they can get on with their jobs, but also so their children can get their education back on track. But I think whenever that choice is of a school opening day, actually perhaps the more important choices for ministers and the Prime Minister are making sure that there's a proper education recovery plan in place. We'll hear about that next week. The week after is the budget, and we have to make sure there isn't just a plan, but there's also the cash to back it up. And it has to be not just short term in terms of how we can help our children recover the education that they've lost, but also beyond that, looking at how we can make sure the education system can help close some of those gaps that open up in those earlier years that mean we don't have a country that's levelling up at the moment. I think we have proper levelling up goals that are around strong foundation in early years, successful school years, helping our children get the right advice and experiences. Then we can really have an education system with a purpose of making sure that they come through with the knowledge, the skills, the capabilities and the experience to connect them up with all of those opportunities that are going to be there in the future, whether it's in the green economy, the tech economy, setting up their own businesses. That's what we now really need to look at, not just the short term, but also the longer term for our education system.
Professor Ferguson, I think even the harshest critic of the government would accept that this has been a very hard thing to govern our way through, a constantly changing situation that even the scientists sometimes couldn't predict. But in your view, what has been their biggest miss, the biggest mistake, the thing that they've got most wrong that they need to put right this time round?
I mean, think clearly, and this has been seen across Europe, it's not just the UK government. The biggest mistake was failing to control the rate of growth of infection in the autumn. You can go back to March last year and say, you know, Britain responded too late, but in some sense, we had hopefully, I thought, learned that lesson then, but we failed to implement it in the autumn. So we had this problem of ever rising case numbers and then only reacting really late October and then into November. And that set us up for very high infection levels going through the winter.